making decisions in your API architecture and documenting them is important. And to learn more how to do that and give you an idea of a simple framework, how you may be able to do that in your own API journey, we have Grygoriy Gonchar joining us. In your most recent position, you were VP of Engineering at Heycar. Hey, Grygoriy, thanks for joining.
Hey Eric, pleasure to join you for this conversation.
Yeah, it's something that I'm really have been looking forward to. So you published an article on InfoQ where you were introducing a framework for making and documenting architecture decisions. And I think that's something that's really interesting because we always talk about an API journey, how everything is evolving, how the landscape is evolving, and how technology is evolving, and all these kind of things. So I think it's a good idea to structure a little bit how you are making decisions, what you use, documenting those decisions so that people can understand where things are going and why. Can you talk us a little bit through your role and your responsibilities in your most recent role as a VP of engineering at Heycar, and why you came up with that particular framework?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. So in my recent role as VP of engineering, I was looking after engineering processes and leading multiple teams in our organization, and actually looking after global governance that we want to establish across Heycar, how we can be more effective in our day-to-day engineering duties, including things like how we can make engineering decisions efficiently, how we can communicate those decisions, how we can share knowledge across teams. That was largely the focus I wanted to address. And basically, as an outcome of some of this work, I brought those ideas together that I shared in the article. But also, I must share and admit that most of the ideas, as they are, I met them during my time with eBay. So as head of engineering, as a principal engineer, I actually was working with many of the building blocks we introduced then at Heycar, and I also described in my article. So I can say that the article actually is representing my experience across two organizations.
Okay, that's good. I think that's also good because that demonstrates that these kind of things are things you can apply in a variety of scenarios. It's not specific for this only works here. It's
That's basically was my motivation to write this article, because I saw that actually the very same building blocks are working in a different context in a different organization, and that made me thinking, okay, this might be something that can work for way more teams. And I also talked to people from different companies through my network, casually asking how they are solving these needs, and I realized that yeah, there is definitely a fit of this framework for broader use.
Yeah, and I think that's the also the purpose of this video is to share this experience, to tell people, hey, maybe this is something for you, check it out, and without trying to belittle what you've done, but I mean, to some extent, you've just taken some ingredients that have been established somewhere else and combined them in a way to come up with this combination that worked for you. And I think that's a valuable thing to share and for people to maybe understand how it works and to check it out. So let's look at those ingredients. What is the first ingredient that you are proposing when you come to thinking about this framework?
It's a good question. I would describe the three ingredients with kind of two layers. And I would start with the layer on the top, which is architecture decision records. Some people also know the methodology called lightweight RFCs. So they are very close to architecture decision records. Both are basically giving a format how to document your important technical decisions. So usually you give the decision like some name, for example, using a framework XYZ, or introducing an API for that particular purpose. For example, introducing like order cancellation API, that would be a name of your ADR. Then you give some context and background. So in case of an API, so why this API is needed, what kind of business challenge we are addressing. Then you can describe some decisions and options that you considered. For example, you perhaps considered building this API with GraphQL, or you considered making this API RESTful, or maybe you considered some other data format, the JSON. So you describe those options and the table in the body of your architecture decision record, and then you document your decision. That is basically what architecture decisions records are about. So why do we need one? First of all, it's a standardized record that many teams across your organization can follow. And one benefit you achieve is that your technical decisions and some architecture documentation that they bring, they are in one consistent format that all teams know how to read and understand. And this is crucial for knowledge sharing, because in larger organizations, especially in distributed ones, people are not always working like next to each other closely to understand what's happening in other teams. So one way to learn this, they can read through ADRs of other teams to stay up to date. And in this way, they can also not reinvent the wheel when needed, because they can actually know that some teams solved particular challenge already. And the second, it gives a good indication when decision is already made or finalized, because in ADR you can use clearly designated status of an ADR. So if decision is still evaluated in progress, you can clearly reflect that. And when you say, let's say the status is like decided or done, then that means the decision is actually closed and that kind of discussion is over at this stage.
Yeah, and I think that that part that you were pointing out, that people don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that is kind of one of the major benefits of this, right? That if people revisit that, you can just very quickly point to this and say, yes, this is an important decision to make, and you should discuss this, but we have discussed this, and here's what we decided, right? And the discussion is over now, so that can save a lot of time.
Agreed.
But you need to get to those decisions, right? So, and I think this is where we can then look at the additional ingredients. So, of course, these decisions need to be made, but these decisions also need to be made with some foundation to be built on, some background that establishes the discussion that is had to make those decisions. So let's move on to your next ingredient then.
Absolutely. So the next layer, I call it something that is enabling the foundation for other decisions. Basically, a part of your governance that is driving reoccurring concerns. Let me explain you this idea. So perhaps whenever you are developing new features, extension to your product, you are not always thinking, oh, which programming language should I use? Because there's already a programming language in place. Of course, if you are like more into distributed architecture like microservices, then you can have a choice how to build your new microservice with which new technologies, or like should you use something that is already adopted by the company, should you introduce something new. Same, for example, with data storage needs, like choosing a database or like how to deploy your code with like, for example, containers, or using serverless approach, or using something else. So those decisions we have to make over and over again. And the other part of this framework that I introduced in the article, they are exactly covering the need of those reoccurring decisions. So those ingredients are the technology radar. And the technology radar is the concept I learned from ThoughtWorks, the consulting company. They publish regularly a report about the technologies they observe in the fields with their like perceived status. Are they currently in trial? Are they assessed? Are they adopted, or are they on hold by the industry? And I think they also introduced an idea to use such a framework or tool, technology radar, also for companies internally, so that inside a larger organization, you can also document what are the technologies that are adopted, that are, for example, assessed. And that is like the next building block in the framework. So introducing such a classification of your technologies in-house, representing them visually as a radar, showing like what are the choices and the technologies that are already adopted. So the basic usage of this tool would be just document things as they are. A next step could be also thinking about like some process how the new technology can be introduced. Are we encouraged or allowed in our organization to consider other programming languages? For example, if organization already use a variety of those, for example, let's say it would be a Python and Go, do we want to consider nowadays also like a new other languages, for example, Kotlin or Java? Is it really necessary? Can we use something that is similar but already adopted? Same with other like technologies and frameworks. So if let's say we are using Java and we are using Spring Framework actively, do we want to introduce many more frameworks for similar needs? So these are all the good questions that the team needs to answer, and the answer to these questions is very organization specific. Some teams may put a bit more like governance process in place and to make this new technology introduction a bit more formal. For some teams, it may be just enough to have a picture of documentation, what is already adopted, what is currently being assessed.
Okay, so yeah, I see that the radar, and I guess most people probably watching this have seen the radar in some shape or form. It has been around for quite a while, and it's always an interesting thing to look at. And I think it's a good inspiration actually from what you're saying, right? That it makes sense to not just take the radar that is, for example, produced by ThoughtWorks, but also to think about like establishing your own radar where you're saying, okay, what's on our radar, right? How do we see the world? And I think that's really an interesting kind of twist on this radar idea. Okay, that was ingredient number 2, and now let's move on to ingredient number 3, and which is
Yeah, third and the last one in this framework is technology standards. They are in a way similar, more similar to the technology radar than they are to ADRs. Why so? So technology standards would be an internal standards that the company can introduce, also to help with standardizing those recurring questions and concerns. For example, many companies prefer to have an API design standard, which would, for example, specify naming conventions. So if we are using JSON as a payload, should we use always snake case or camel case? Do we want to standardize some specific headers across organization, for example, for correlation ID, for tracing, for other troubleshooting needs? Do we want to have similar or same method of authentication and authorization across our APIs within organizations so that it's more convenient for the consumer, so those API to always use similar methods for authentication and authorization? Do we want to constrain ourselves perhaps for a specific usage of some status codes on top of like HTTP specification? Do we want to like maybe a little bit customize that usage, or was it already customized for a specific reason before, and now it's like confusing some new joiners so that we have to document it now? So that is like a good example of what a standard is. So as you see, it's close to a technology radar in a way that whenever you are now working, for example, with APIs in your team, you are constantly referring to the standard where you, for example, add a new endpoint, you know how to do it like in harmonized way with the rest of your team. And that's not only about APIs. You can also have such a standard for monitoring needs. Do you want to have the similar or same monitoring across microservices in different teams so that, for example, your on-call process and on-call duty is a bit more easy and smooth, and different team members from different teams can quickly understand the monitoring and metrics across your services?
yeah. I mean, it's definitely much bigger than APIs only, but I think it does affect APIs, right? In the sense that there are certain technologies for APIs and so forth. But yeah, you're certainly right. It's a wider usage of these things. And what I really like about your thing, when I talk about making decisions and how to do that, I often talk about 3 things. Where it's like, why are you doing this? What are you doing, and how exactly are you doing it? And I think what you've done very nicely aligns with this, right? The why is really the ADR, right? So we're thinking about why why are we using this? What else did we consider, right? So this is kind of the rationale why we picked this. What are we using? Is this technology radar, right? It's like we picked one of these things that was basically at our disposal. And then in my mind, the guidelines very much are a deeper dive into how specifically are we using this, what are practices that we're using, what are tools that we're using in-house, right? So it's really kind of this three-layered approach. And I really like it. I think it's a good structure that you've created there. Is that so for these, I'm just curious in terms of the, let's say, the volume. So how many ADRs did you have? How big was this framework, or were the things that you were creating in that framework when used that with eBay and Heycar?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for your kind feedback. Speaking about volume, I think it will a lot depend on how exactly you will want to use ADRs. So speaking about volume of things represented in technology radar, it's not a lot actually, as the organizations I was working at, they didn't had a huge variety of technologies, at least like in a small organizational units. So I'm speaking about eBay now. So eBay can use many technologies in different organizational units, but in our unit, let's say it was a bit more harmonized and standardized. There would be like a couple of programming languages, couple of main frameworks, then of course all the infrastructure tools we use. So all in all, the number of items represented in technology radars created by companies internally would be measured in dozens and probably reach up to 100, I would say, just my rough feeling. Speaking about standards, there will be usually way few of them. So in teams I was working with, I've seen a need for at most a dozen or 15 standards, so to say. So there are limited things you really want to have such a standard for. So I brought a couple of examples like API design or naming convention, monitoring needs, logging needs, some analytical and data tracking needs. Those are usually things on top of the mind of every engineering team, but you can add some more, for example, like your specific security standard if you're working with sensitive data or in highly regulated environment. Or you may want to give a specific guidance for GDPR compliance, so data privacy law in Europe. That would be another example. But as you see, the number of ideas for those standards is rather limited. So where volume comes is from your architecture decision records. And this is also where every team can decide for which needs those architecture decisions will be used. Um, I find it a well-described idea to say that whenever your decision is complex enough, that it needs a documentation, it needs some diagram, it needs some visualization. So whenever you feel that to explain your decision to colleagues, you definitely need some visual material or things in writing. That's a good reason to introduce an ADR. So whenever you're thinking to create some technical documentation, that's probably a reason to create an ADR. That's how I find it most easy to explain. Some companies, of course, can be a bit more formal and say, okay, whenever you introduce a new API endpoint or a new microservice or a new component in your front-end code, then you may need an ADR. That could be other way to specify it more concrete and strictly. And then also teams can adopt these technologies to or tools to different extent. So I've seen teams who are creating ADRs a bit more often, and then they almost do not create additional technical documentation. And I've seen teams which create some extra technical documentation, or they had it before. They prefer to extend it as well. Therefore, their architecture decision records can be a bit more lean with references to those other documentation sources. That is also fine if there is already like another good alternative implemented in place. And answering the very last question here, so speaking about volumes, so this is where like you would have probably, like, it depends on the size of your organization a lot, but let's say if you have an organization of 100 engineers, then you should expect thousands of ADRs per year. That would be roughly the volume.
Okay, so quite a bit. So that would mean at least that you should think about automating that in some way, right? Like, so not just an ad hoc way of dealing with it, but really creating some processes around this so that you can actually find the ADRs and that people have tools supporting them, creating and managing them.
Yeah, that's another good question. We didn't speak yet about the tooling. When I think about the tooling for those needs, I would always recommend to pick something that is already adopted and in use by the teams. So it really like simplifies the adoption of those methodologies. Because imagine you would have to introduce some new approach of documenting things or like making technical decisions. But if it also comes with some completely new tool, that is another like challenge to spread the adoption more easily. So for instance, if you are using like an internal wiki platforms, like an Atlassian Confluence platform, for instance, or like a GitHub wiki functionality, you can keep using those for standards and for ADRs. If you are using a lot the documentation inside your repositories, for example, in Markdown files, another good way for structuring those documents could be using a GitHub or like another version control repository to store your ADRs. One nice benefit with it is that whenever you make a change to an ADR, you can use pull requests and you can add all the people who are involved in the reviewers. You can clearly see when changes are approved with like pull request approval, and when changes are finally merged, you can assume that, yeah, the people have closed the conversation. So it brings this clarity, and also it uses extremely familiar framework for software engineers. So that's just exactly how they would do with their other pull requests, with changing the code, with adding new features. So that is definitely a consideration I would suggest to everyone not trying to adopt those things like ADRs.
Yeah, I think that's a good recommendation to just look at the tooling that you have and then take whatever is most familiar to people and is a good match. And I think GitHub there is a pretty popular choice. Even then, you probably want to have some processes around how exactly it's done, but that's typically not that much work. So if people understand GitHub, they will be able to catch up with that pretty quickly, I guess. Great. So I think that actually is a very useful way of organizing all these things. We'll link to your InfoQ article from the description, and for anybody looking for further help on these things, such as the technology radar and the ADRs and the guidelines, there are a lot of links in your article, I think, right? So people can explore even further. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. Thanks so much, Grygoriy, for joining. I think that was really helpful. I hope that a lot of people will at least be inspired, or they just use the approach that you were describing, like we discussed. Right? It's definitely a reoccurring problem that will be something that is happening in a lot of organizations. Any closing words from you, Grygoriy?
Well, first of all, thanks, Eric, for inviting me for this conversation. It was really a pleasure to reflect about those thoughts and share them with broader audience. Maybe I would like to add that I think you can play with those blocks and adopt those that are needed by your organization. Also, I would like to highlight that we didn't really reinvent any of those. As you mentioned, there are links to the technology radar, there are links to examples of other companies publishing their technology standards and examples of ADRs. So feel free to check out more information in this direction.
Yes. Okay. So thanks everybody for watching. If you found this interesting and or helpful, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. And with that, we're done for today. Thanks for watching and keep getting APIs to work. Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.